Welcome to the first three Tandy episodes of Dinty's Hideaway, featuring an interview with John V Roach, the former CEO of Radio Shack Corporation, Tandy Corporation, and the father of the TRS80 line of personal computers. You have to take my word for it. You'll hear from John Roach himself. This first interview will cover the TRS80 and color computer, and we're calling this episode TRS76.
Three or 4 years old and moved to Fort Worth and have been here ever since, except my dad, at the time I was born, owned a butcher shop in a grocery store in Stamford. And during World War II, when meat was rationed, he couldn't get enough meat to make a living. So we moved to Fort Worth, and he worked as a meat inspector for 3 or 4 or 5 years, and then after the war opened a small grocery store. And my mother was a registered nurse, and she worked just about all the time and worked for many years as an industrial nurse for Montgomery Ward. Well, I knew if I were going to amount to anything, I had to make it happen. And so I worked unloaded boxcars. I ran a freight elevator. I was a roughneck in the oil field. And even a student engineer for the phone company. I worked all the way through college. I knew just a little bit about computers, and so they hired me to run their computer operation, which was fairly small, about 7 or 8 people, and running an old 1410, I think was the number. I started out running their computer operation, and it was much larger than the one I had had before. We had about 30 key punch operators. We had half a dozen programmers and probably a half a dozen people in the operations area. And it was a great time to be getting there. That would be 1967. I had to have an interview with Charles before I went to work, and it was a very interesting interview. It started about 6 o'clock on a Friday night. We were supposed to have dinner. Well, we talked until 9, started to have dinner, and the phone rings, and something called the Tandy Mart, which was about 5 or 6 different Tandy stores plus a bowling alley, was on fire. So we jumped in his car and drive down. Of course, traffic was jammed up, so he just drove on the sides, on the shoulders and what have you. And, well, we got down there, and I don't know, I didn't get home till about 1 o'clock that night after an unusual interview. First things I did was gather up half a dozen engineers from the various plants we had and put them in a unit to try to develop more products for the plant. And of course, a fella, one of our buyers, Don French, who was responsible for buying parts and pieces and for the Radio Shack store. Well, he one of the some of his vendors were semiconductor companies and what have you. They were talking to him about computer chips, along with everything else. I said, well, we ought to be in that business, shouldn't we? And he checked around a little bit, and there wasn't anybody had any interest. I'm talking about IBM, Digital Equipment, Texas Instruments. There wasn't anybody that had any interest in talking about making a computer for us to sell. And so I told our engineering group, let's see if we can put one together. In the early process, I was out in Silicon Valley and with the head of this engineering group, looking for parts that we could use from a manufacturing standpoint, primarily looking for CB radio parts. And among the places we visited on that trip was National Semiconductor. And I asked them what they were doing in the computer chip area. Well, they brought in a guy named Steve Leninger, and Steve told us what they were doing, and he told us there was a computer store there in San Jose, and we got the address and what have you. And that night, after we got through with our other calls, we go to the computer store. Well, you got to understand what a computer store was. And that was just some PC boards and some power supplies and components and nothing assembled. And you really had to build a computer from scratch if you wanted to buy one in there. And but here's Steve Leninger shows up again. And so we talked to him some more. And that night, as we left that store, I told our engineering manager, I said, let's hire that guy. Steve did the hardware design, basically, and he did the basic interpreter. And so when we got to the point where we had a fairly decent hardware prototype, we set it up in the only conference room Radio Shack had, and got Mr. Tandy and Lou Cornfell in to look at it, and they gave us a nod to go ahead and try to build the thing. It was about 8 months to get to the point where we could introduce the computer. About halfway in there, they had something called the first West Coast Computer Fair out in San Francisco. And I went to that, and it was about like the computer store. There wasn't any finished systems working there. There was a mock prototype of a Commodore PET, and there was an Apple table, and I think they probably still had the Apple I at that point. So the interesting part, though, about the West Coast Computer Fair was in a hotel ballroom. 14,000 people paid $14 a head to walk through that bunch of components. And I said, we were not displaying anything here. And I said, I believe we're going to be able to sell some computers if there's this kind of interest. Introduced it on August the 3rd, 1977. This is the model, so-called Model 1. We didn't call it a Model 1 then because that's the only one there was. But ultimately became that. Now, part of what you have to understand about the Model 1 is Radio Shack had never sold anything over $500 ever. And was very nervous about whether or not they could sell anything over 500. She went to RCA and they had an old black and white monitor that had a gray plastic case. And so we could, they would make a little modification to it and we could use it. Had been a television, they could be a monitor for us. And that was gray. So when we designed the keyboard that had all the guts of the computer in it was same gray plastic basically. That's how it got to be kind of like it was. Of course, we used a tape recorder out of the Radio Shack line for the I/O. When we got the introduction, I imagined we had spent $150,000. I mean, we didn't spend much. And so we went to New York on August 3rd, 77. We at the Warwick Hotel, we had a small room, had a couple of prototypes up there, or they were really working machines. And we had some media come by, but by the time we got back to Fort Worth, the orders were flooding in. And the assembly line hadn't started. It was about a month after that before we could start the assembly line. And of course, we carefully tested each thing that came off the line because our whole design at that early stage was probably a little shaky to ship 5,000 machines before the end of the year. And that's not a lot, but I don't think anybody else shipped any. Sales were strong. We got our manufacturing going strong. When I say strong, we sold over 100,000. The numbers in those days, today they sell millions of things the first day. We were just glad to sell 100,000 plus. One of the things we did during that period is we called them blitzes, but they were really barnstorming shows. We would go into a city and take a ballroom and a hotel and set up about 20 or 25 machines, invite the local stockbrokers to come in after the market closed, and then from 6 to 9 at night, we run a newspaper ad, and it was open to the public. Named Bill Gates had written a pretty good basic for what was it, Bits Altair or whatever was in Albuquerque, and he was in Albuquerque, or his company was, the beginnings of Microsoft at the time. And I said, well, I want him here next Saturday. And sure enough, about Wednesday morning, here comes this kid that's not very dry behind the ears and that was Bill Gates. And he had come early. He and his dad had drawn up a contract. It was about a page and a half, and he went through the deliverables, and he got to the price, and it's been documented enough places. He came to the price. I told him horse shit. And when he would tell the story after that, he'd say, my dad and I had done a lot of role playing before I came down there. So hopefully I could answer all the questions well and what have you. He said he didn't tell me what to say when you said horse shit. Or it was Microsoft's biggest customers for until after they got into the IBM PC business. We developed two other computers kind of simultaneously. One of them color computer, which you referred to, and one of them that we call the Model 2, which was more of a business computer. And we sold lots of Model 2s. One of the things in the information you'd give me, you worried about the gross margin. I can remember one Saturday morning sitting in the office on the Model 2 and saying, let's set the gross margin at 75%. I mean, the computers that we made after the initial ones were very profitable for us. I mean, it came down from that fairly quickly, but not real quick. On the color computer, there was a little debate internally because the engineer said, well, there's nothing to use the color for. And, well, that's what the consumer wants for their games and what have you. And so the color computer, Gates himself wrote the basic for it. And he has said on a few occasions that that's the last computer that he actually wrote software for. People really liked, I mean, the computer geeks that really were into the how's all this work and doing their own thing. They liked the color computer. It was relatively low priced, and we sold it for a number of years, and it had several iterations over the years. They were certainly involved and had their chip in it and what have you. We had a Motorola, a guy that was a director, was an executive at Motorola, I guess he was CEO at Motorola, or of the semiconductor division. And he wanted to get in on the act. He liked of all our computers that had a Motorola chip. But yeah, we had a lot of help from Motorola on that color computer. We were primarily, our limited resources went to the Model 2 and then the Model 3, and so we weren't opposed to getting any help anybody would give us. The Commodore PET never was a real, we didn't feel like, I mean, we certainly acknowledged them, and but they came along with something, I think it's called a Commodore 64 or something after the PET, and it was sold a lot more machines and was very competitive with the color computer and what have you. And of course, for our big advantage early is we had a lot of stores to sell them in. I think Commodore was probably the first one that got very broad distribution in other stores. We were kind of nervous when they were going to come out with it. We thought they'd be a really tough competitor, and they did a lot of PR and advertising when they initially introduced their machine, but for whatever reason, it didn't sell very well. The way the conference thing was set up, right in front of the podium, they had our machine and Texas Instruments and 3 or 4 others. I can't remember what all exactly was there. And I kind of looked over the podium or rostrum, whatever you call it, and saw the TI machine down there. And I said, well, that's the first TI machine I've seen in a long time. I know one of the magazines, Forbes or somebody, started an article And Roach said that's the first TI machine he had seen, and nobody else has seen one either. And it just never got the distribution. I don't know. It was probably an okay machine, but it didn't really ever turn out to be a competitor the way the Commodore and Apple and IBM and others became real competitors.
Let the Radio Shack TRS80 put the world of color computing into your home. Instant loading program packs turn any color TV into an exciting game arcade. And there's more. The color computer is an educational aid, a home management tool, an up-to-the-minute electronic information service. The programmable, expandable TRS80 color computer from $399 only at Radio Shack, the biggest name in little computers.